Good morning, everybody. It is Evan Weiner here. I hope that you're having a good day so far. I'm going to be talking about something that happened a very, very long time ago in 1960. I was watching on Buzzer TV on a Saturday morning just about a month ago an old Price is Right with Bill Cullen from 1959. And I had noticed something that I had never noticed before on other TV shows. The prizes that were given away on The Price is Right circa 1950 included cars from the Ford Auto Company in Michigan, including speedboats from Evinrude in Indiana, motorhome built in Ohio. There were gifts from upstate New York, or prizes from upstate New York that were built in upstate New York and all throughout the Rust Belt. And I speak on cruise ships. And I do talk about Quebec and Canada when I'm on cruise ships. And I talk about the St. Lawrence Seaway. And the St. Lawrence Seaway took the place of the Erie Canal in 1959. And arguably, you could say that was the beginning of the end of the Rust Belt. So you have the Rust Belt, which is still doing well in 1960. But there are a lot of things that are going on. Like down in Greensboro, North Carolina, these people are staging a sit-in because they would not be, they were not going to be served food at the counter at a Woolworths. And that was really the start of the next round of the civil rights movement. Fidel Castro is now in his second year as the leader in Cuba. A pilot by the name of Gary Francis Powers, or Francis Gary Powers, is captured. He is flying a U-2 over the Soviet Union and spying on the Soviet Union, and that becomes a big, big flashpoint in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong on the left, Nikita Khrushchev on the right, the USSR, Khrushchev, and Red China. Oh, my old social studies teacher from ninth grade, Stewie Gates, would be so happy calling them either Red China or Communist China, because that's what he hammered into us in 1969. Their relationship is on the ropes. Oh, you have the presidential race of that year, and this presidential race would change how politics, presidential politics and running for the president would happen after 1960 because of this picture here, the presidential debate in Chicago, the TV debate, which came up with the question, does he look presidential or not? It's also a year of independence in Africa. More than a dozen countries become independent in the continent. And the business of America was the business of America. Chevrolet, General Motors, Ford, U.S. Steel, and a whole bunch of other companies that today are just a shadow of themselves from 60 years ago. U.S. Steel. Elvis goes back to the civilian life. Cassius Clay hits the world stage. The Beatles become the Beatles. But let's start with these guys. They are in Greensboro, North Carolina, and all they want is a meal at Woolworths. Now, I don't know how great Woolworths meals were. I do remember that Woolworths had a distinct smell, and you could get anything and everything in the world, from a screwdriver to a hammer to thread at Woolworths. But these guys were hungry, and they wanted to eat. 4 African-American college students, Ezel A. Blair Jr., Franklin E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond, decide they're hungry, and they sit down at a lunch counter at a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they ask for service. This is on February 1st, 1960, and it's Jim Crow time. There was no such person as Jim Crow. It's just these laws that separated whites from African Americans, and they were not supposed to be sitting in proper society, although I'm not sure you could call Woolworths proper society, but they're sitting and they just want a meal. And they were refused service, and they were told, you have to leave. But they didn't leave. They remained in their seats, and their passive resistance and peaceful sit-down demand helped ignite a youth-led movement to challenge racial inequity throughout the South. And this isn't too far after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. And it's within 2 decades of Randolph and FDR, Randolph going to FDR and saying, hey, you know, we're people too, give us some jobs. And he won. So the civil rights movement is really in full swing, starting with this protest, the counter protest in North Carolina. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was formed at a conference at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. That was attended by 126 delegates from 58 sit-in centers. This had spread throughout the South in 12 states, and also from 19 northern colleges. And from the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, the Fellowship of Reconciliation for the National Student Association, and the Students for a Democratic Society. The 1960s, as far as protests, start here with those guys at the counter and would last throughout the decades. The 1960s, in a lot of ways, in 1960 is the roadmap for the rest of your lives. That's Julian Bond. And in 1978, I got to interview Julian Bond at Rockland Community College. He was there on the speaker series. I was 22 years old at the time, and I was working at WGRC Radio and also for the Rockland Review and Rockland Community College up in Muncie, New York, in Rockland County, New York, 25, 30 miles north of Manhattan, had this speaker series. And I got to speak to Julian Bond and Ralph Nader and a whole bunch of others at the age of 22. He is the leader, or one of the leaders, of SNCC, along with another guy just recently passed away, John Lewis, the longtime congressman from Georgia. SNCC was made up of people like Diane Nash, Marion Barry, who would eventually become the mayor of Washington, and John Lewis from Fisk University, and the American Baptist Theological Seminary students, including James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette. And they're all involved in the Nashville student movement. And their mentor is at Vanderbilt University, a guy by the name of James Lawson. Charles F. McDew led the student protest at South Carolina State. J. Charles Jones, Johnson C. Smith University, North Carolina. Julian Bond, who, as I said, I interviewed in 1978 from Morehouse College in Atlanta, and Stokely Carmichael from Howard University, Washington, D.C. Many of these people would have their own civil rights movements or offshoots of the civil rights movement. Carmichael. Bond would become a state senator from Georgia. Lewis was with SNCC. And all these people were together at this point, and then they would all separate into separate areas of the civil rights movement. There was a Civil Rights Act that was signed May 6, 1960. It was aimed at strengthening and covering loopholes in the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which meant there would be federal inspection of local voter registration polls by appointed referees, which would oversee Southern elections and ensure that African Americans were permitted to vote. Penalties for anyone who obstructed someone's attempt to register to vote or to vote were imposed. Prosecution for interfering with court orders regarding school desegregation, also part of this act, as the United States began to look into the problem of civil rights. And it was Dwight Eisenhower and then John Kennedy, and they kind of, yeah, let's get some laws done, but they didn't do enough. And that's why all the protests at this point. Dwight Eisenhower is the president of the United States. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King is around. He's now 31 years old, and he is assuming more and more of the leadership of the civil rights movement. There's a sit-in in Atlanta on October 19th. 52 people, including Martin Luther King Jr., were arrested in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, because they did not want to leave their seats at the segregated rich department store lunch counters. That was Jim Crow's segregation laws. Whites, you could eat here. Negroes, well, they were banned from being served at the department store lunch counters. John Kennedy is running for president at this point, and he gets involved willingly or maybe unwillingly in the civil rights movement because of Martin Luther King. Charges against 16 of the 51 protesters were dismissed, but Dr. King was held on charges that his arrest violated a term of state probation imposed earlier that year. So he's going to jail, and he's sentenced to 6 months at hard labor. John Kennedy is running against Richard Nixon for president, and he decides he is going to get involved in the civil rights movement. So he reaches out to the King family, talks to them, and he would help secure Dr. King's release. There was some hope that John Kennedy would be the civil rights candidate, but that's about as far as he went. You probably don't know who this 4-year-old is. Her name is Ruby Bridges. She was 4 or 5 years old, and she's from New Orleans. And she's going to go to school in a desegregated school, and she's rather young doing it. At the age of 6, she was 6, not 4, I'm sorry about that. Ruby Bridges advanced the cause of civil rights. This is November of 1960. She became the first African-American student to integrate an elementary school in the South. Needless to say, she was not well received by people in New Orleans where she went to school. She walked past crowds. They screamed at her, all kinds of slurs. She's only 6 years old. That's all she is. And she's getting taunted and yelled at. The first day in school, she was in the principal's office all day because the white parents were upset, really, really upset, and they pulled their children from the school. Segregationists withdrew their children permanently because 6-year-old Ruby Bridges is going to school there. The Bridges family had some problems. And, well, you know what? Her father lost his job. Grocery stores refused to sell food to Lucille. Her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm where they had lived for a quarter of a century. This is pure Jim Crow in action in 1960. But there was one teacher, a woman by the name of Barbara Henry. She was a white Boston native who was in New Orleans. And she was the only teacher willing to accept Ruby. And all year there was a class of 1. Barbara Henry and Ruby. And Ruby ate her lunch alone, played with her teacher at recess. She never missed a day at school. Many years later, 30 years later, she was reunited with her first teacher, Barbara Henry. And for a while in the 1990s, they did things like me. They gave speaking engagements together. Norman Rockwell, Saturday Evening Post. He was not allowed to draw pictures about the civil rights movement for the Saturday Evening Post. But in 1964, he did a picture, or he drew a picture of Ruby Bridges going to school in New Orleans, surrounded by marshals. 1964, the problem we all live with. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, this is on the heels of the McCarthy years. McCarthy had been long gone by this point, or 3 years gone by this point. But looking for communists everywhere. The House on Un-American Activities was looking for communists, trying to figure out if they're infiltrating the government. Remember, it's the middle of the Cold War here, and Eisenhower and Khrushchev, even though they're trying to look for something in common for some sort of détente, that wasn't happening very quickly. The House on Un-American Activities held hearings in San Francisco. That was May 12th through 14th to investigate alleged communist subversion. In 1959, the House on Un-American Activities subpoenaed San Francisco Bay Area journalists, college professors, 110 public school teachers, leaked their names to the local press, and they were going after them, but they decided, you know what, the public knows too much about it, so we're not going to go after them. But in 1960, here we go again. The House on Un-American Activities is looking everywhere and anywhere for communists, and they're in San Francisco, and there's a bunch of students, peaceful protesters, outside of the San Francisco City Hall, and they were the House of Un-American Activities people were inside the building, and they were greeted by all these protesters. As you can see here, there's some bedlam that broke out, and a demonstration, and complete with water cannons at that point. Kind of a riot breaks out on May 13th. A police riot squad turned fire hoses on protesters in the Rotunda without warning, inspired by the recent luncheon counter sit-ins of the civil rights movement. The demonstrators sat down and sang, we shall not be moved." Some were washed down the marble staircase, others dragged by their feet, bumping their heads on every step. The local and the national news media called it a riot. They blamed it on the protesters. In response, 5,000 people turned out for the final day protest. Hard to call it a riot. Something did happen, but the media blamed it on the students. Out of this would come the civil rights and anti-war protesters in the 1960s. Something called SLATE, a University of California, Berkeley student group, along with civil rights groups and labor leaders, organized that San Francisco protest. It would be this protest that would spark students to demonstrate at Berkeley during the 1960s. And Berkeley was called at that point the University of Berkeley because there were so many protests going there. But that was the epicenter in the Bay Area of San Francisco of protests. Tom Hayden helped organize the Students for Democratic Society in 1962. And he talked to the people from SLATE. These would be the people that 5, 6, 7 years later would organize all the anti-war demonstrations, the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in the San Francisco Bay Area. Meanwhile, a lot of people used to go down to Cuba and have a good time in Cuba, from what I was told. There were a lot of casinos there, Americans vacation there, and that all abruptly comes to an end when Fidel Castro and a bunch of people decide they've had enough of the dictator Batista, who is absolutely corrupt, and they've had enough of all the other influences from America and Cuba, and it's time to get rid of them. This is a ragtag band of people that Castro has put together, and somehow the ragtag band of people do take over the country. Fidel Castro establishes a socialized state after he and a group of guerrilla fighters successfully revolt against the president, Batista. Batista was, I guess you could say, supported by Dwight Eisenhower because he had an anti-communist stance, but he fled the country in 1959. He was there from 1952, and he was a dictatorial rule guy. Castro gradually strengthens relations with the Soviet Union, which is a thorn in the side of Dwight Eisenhower and the United States State Department. Cuba suddenly becomes a major, major problem for the United States. In 1960, Castro nationalized all foreign assets in Cuba. He hiked taxes on U.S. imports and established trade deals with Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. Eisenhower retaliated by slashing the import quota for Cuban sugar, froze Cuban assets in the United States, imposed a near full trade embargo, and cut off diplomatic ties with the Castro government. Once a playpen for Americans wasn't there anymore. There's always been this question about Fidel Castro. How good a baseball player was Fidel Castro, and was he good enough to get a contract for the Washington Senators baseball team? Because in the 1950s, the Washington Senators signed Camilo Pascual and a whole bunch of other really good Cuban players, and Cuban players were coming to the United States as well. Over the years, I befriended this guy, Jose Valdiviso. He was on Channel 47 over in Linden, New Jersey, the TV station in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And one day, my wife and I were out, and Jose was out, and I introduced Jose to my wife, and I said, Jose, let's set the record straight about Fidel Castro. We've heard that Castro had a tryout. He was a pitcher, and he was a good baseball prospect. And this is what my old friend, Jose Valdiviso, said. July 8th, Castro ended the American ownership of the AAA Havana International League baseball team. The Sugar Kings from Havana would move to Jersey City for the rest of the year. The team was top-level Cincinnati Reds farm team. Did Castro have a chance to play for that team or any team? Well, Valdiviso said no. He said that back in those days, Cuban kids, and this is the 1940s and 50s, would play baseball from night to day. And they'd always be out there and always be out there. And you knew who the good players were. But everybody would get a tryout. Nobody didn't get a tryout. If you were good enough to have a uniform on, you got a tryout. And Fidel Castro got a tryout. He wasn't very good. In fact, Jose Valdiviso said he was awful and he was terrible. and he was not much of a baseball prospect. Unfortunately for Jose, he never went home after the takeover by the Castro government. And he was very bitter, as you might imagine. He ended up living in New Jersey, ended up being on TV in New Jersey. And I considered him a pretty good acquaintance. We used to sit around and used to talk about him. And every once in a while, I'd say, did Castro ever pitch to you? He said, no, 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 I was good. He wasn't good. After Castro's decision to sign the treaty with the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower administration began financing and training a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Cuban leader. Castro responded by increasing his program of nationalizing foreign property and companies. This would eventually lead to the Bay of Pigs, which would take place in 1961 when Dwight Eisenhower was out of office. The Cold War continues. The Cold War had started after the end of World War II with the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries, and the West. And Eisenhower and Khrushchev did look at ways to cool down the Cold War, but that wasn't happening. And there is Nikita Khrushchev in the middle of that picture, and he's in Paris for a meeting. There was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in 1960 to see if they could tone it down a bit. But on May 1st, the Soviets shut down an American U-2 reconnaissance jet flying over the territory, their territory. Since June of 1956, Eisenhower had approved of secret flights over the Soviet territory because they wanted to know whether or not the Soviets had gained missile superiority over the Americans. That would be something John Kennedy would campaign on in 1960, the missile gap. Not knowing that the Soviets had captured the pilot and got a confession confirming the spy mission, Eisenhower claimed that the aircraft was merely a weather plane. Khrushchev presented the pilot as proof that Eisenhower had lied. And there is the pilot, Francis Powers, Gary Francis Powers, who was shut down. On May 5th, Khrushchev told the Supreme Soviet of the USSR that the spy plane had been shut down on May 1st, and he referred to the flight as an aggressive act by the United States. Wait, are we heading to war here again? On May 7th, Khrushchev revealed that the pilot of the plane had parachuted to safety. He was alive. He was in Moscow. He was okay. And he testified that he had taken off in Pakistan, and his mission was to fly across the Soviet Union over the Aral Sea and back to a place in Norway. He was collecting intelligence information en route, and he also admitted that he was working for the CIA. So there are summit talks that are scheduled for Paris, and there is Eisenhower, and there is Nikita Khrushchev, and that guy is not leaving any doubt where he's from. He's got the USSR tag on him. So there's a scheduled summit in Paris, and it's on May 16th, and Khrushchev said, I'm not coming. I'm not coming. Go home. I'm not coming. You could go. I'm not coming. Why would I want to talk to Eisenhower? Why would I want to talk to Britain? Why would I want to talk to France? You're going to stop the flights over our territory? You're going to apologize for all this? You're going to punish these people? Well, Eisenhower said, yeah, we'll suspend flights during the remainder of the presidency. His presidency was going to be up on January 20th, 1961. But that didn't satisfy Nikita Khrushchev, and the conference was scrapped or adjourned. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was supposed to go to Moscow in June of 1960, and that's scrapped. Eisenhower and Khrushchev had publicly indicated their desire for an easing of Cold War tensions. Hey, back in 1958, Eisenhower sent a hockey team and a track and field team over to Moscow, signed the goodwill, and Khrushchev sent over the Moscow Circus. I loved when they were on Ed Sullivan Show, remember? And they had the dancing bears and all that, and the Boy Show ballet. It was great. But the U-2 incident ended that. Powers was tried and convicted of espionage in the USSR. He was released in 1962 in exchange for a Soviet spy by the name of Rudolf Abel, who was in prison in the United States. Meanwhile, the beginnings of the Berlin Wall start on September 8th, 1960, as the German Democratic Republic, or better known as the Soviet satellite, East Germany limits the access to East Berlin for West Berliners. This is the beginning of the Berlin Wall. Meanwhile, there's Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev, better days. Khrushchev had lost face with communists or Red China because he didn't punish the United States over the U-2 incident. He just put powers in jail, and that would create a rift between the USSR and Red China. But you know what? The rift had already started a couple of years earlier because Mao Zedong wasn't really too happy with Eisenhower and Khrushchev doing this cultural exchange. And he also criticized Yugoslavia and Tito, and Khrushchev criticized Albania because they sided with Mao Zedong. So you have the Cold War going on between the Soviets and the Americans, and you have another Cold War developing, and this would become really serious, between the Soviets and the Chinese, to the point where the Soviets, Leonid Brezhnev, thought maybe we should nuke them in 1969. Meanwhile, the two of them, Khrushchev and Mao, in Bucharest, Romania, at the international meeting of the communist and workers' parties in November 1960, Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev attacked the Soviet and the Chinese interpretations of Orthodox Marxism and Leninism as the wrong road to the world socialism in the USSR and in China. Mao said that Khrushchev's emphasis on consumer goods and material plenty would make the Soviets' ideology soft and unrevolutionary, to which Khrushchev said, if we could promise the people nothing except revolution, they would scratch their heads and say, isn't it better to have goulash? I guess so. I don't know. Looks tasty. Mao said that Khrushchev's emphasis on consumer goods and material plenty would make the Soviets ideologically soft, unrevolutionary. On August 13th, the USSR withdraws advisors from China. Hey, you spying on us? You spying on us? On us? You're spying on us. The Great Seal Bug. May 26th, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., unveiled the Great Seal Bug before the UN Security Council to counter Soviet denunciations of the American U-2 espionage. The Soviets had presented a replica of the Great Seal of the United States as a gift to Ambassador Averell Harriman in 1946. The gift hung in the U.S. Assembly for many years until 1952. During George F. Kennan's ambassadorship, U.S. security personnel discovered there was a listening device embedded in the Great Seal and revealed that on May 26, 1960. Lodge's unveiling of this Great Seal before the Security Council in 1960 provided proof that the Soviets also spied on the Americans and undercut a Soviet resolution before the Security Council denouncing the United States for its U-2 espionage missions. No wonder I liked Mad Magazine. Spy versus Spy in Mad Magazine. That's what's going on here. And then Khrushchev is back in New York later on that year, and there's always been this question. Did Nikita Khrushchev bang a shoe on the table during a UN meeting? Yes or no? The shoe incident takes place October 12, 1960. Something did happen. Khrushchev's getting upset about something, and he probably pounded his fist on the table, although according to some observing him, he took off his shoe and threatens to pound the table with the shoe in protest against the speech critical of Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. Now, the General Assembly President, Frederick Boland from Ireland, broke his gavel, calling the meeting to order. Khrushchev's image after that was one of a hot-headed buffoon. But did he actually take his shoe and bang it against the desk? Well, his granddaughter says, well, maybe not. Khrushchev did take off his shoes because he was wearing these new Soviet-type shoes, and they're a little tight, and he needed to stretch them out, but couldn't stretch them out. So when he started to pound the table, according to his granddaughter, his watch fell off. And as he picked it up, he also noticed his shoes were on the floor and kind of picked up the shoes as well. There was a photographer from Life magazine by the name of John Longard, who was in the General Assembly that day, and he says, I don't think so. I don't think so. He did not bang his shoe on the desk, but he did have his shoe up. And according to this photographer, he probably meant to do so. Khrushchev is a hothead. Hey, meanwhile, I'm in school, and I'm doing this. Duck and cover, starting in first grade, duck and cover. And I always wondered about duck and cover. You know, we were living under the nuclear threat, with fallout shelters and all this other stuff, sirens going, duck and cover under your desk in your classroom. And I always wondered, you know, I'm ducking and covering, but if they drop a nuclear bomb, and I'm only 5, 6 years old when I'm wondering this, if they drop a nuclear bomb, why is doing this going to protect me? Nobody ever explained why. Well, duck and cover is a method of personal protection against the effects of a nuclear explosion. Ducking and covering is useful at conferring a degree of protection to personnel situated outside the radius of the nuclear fireball, but still within the sufficient range of the nuclear explosion that standing upright and uncovered is likely to cause serious injury or death. It doesn't make any sense, but I guess that's what they told us to do. And I used to remember going under the duck and cover, and I used to look up at the bottom of the desks, and I said, somebody left gum here. There's old gum here. Vietnam, 1960. Americans are involved in Vietnam in 1960. They just don't have very many troops there, but they are involved in 1960. They were in the region because they were conducting operations in nearby Laos to support the Laotian government. This is the time of the domino theory, which is, if any of the Southeast Asian countries fall to communists, all of them will. The United States decides we better send some troops to Vietnam as well, 3,500 troops. Meanwhile, there's a coup against the South Vietnamese president, Diem. That would be one of many coups against him. That was November 12th. And on December 20th, Southern revolutionaries, in South Vietnam, people against Diem. Southern revolutionaries backed by the Northern Vietnamese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh, formed the National Liberation Front, known in Saigon and in Washington as the Viet Cong. And of course, in the 1960s, the Viet Cong would become a daily staple of our news appetite. We would hear about the Viet Cong daily. The presidential race, 1960, two old comrades, John Kennedy on the left, Richard Nixon on the right, both of whom got to the Congress in 1946, started serving in 1947. Nixon became vice president in 1953. He's running against John Kennedy. The United States Senator John Kennedy from Massachusetts, Governor Pat Brown, Jerry Brown's father, from California, the United States Senator Stuart Symington from Missouri, the United States Senator Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas, the former Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, who had lost to Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, 1956, the United States Senator from Oregon, Wayne Morse, and the United States Senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, would all throw their hat in the ring. Ultimately, John Kennedy would prevail. He would get the nomination, and to everybody's surprise, he chose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. Neither Kennedy nor Johnson had much use for one another, but politically, it made sense because Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader. He was from the South, Texas. Kennedy was a guy who was raised in both Boston and New York, lived in Massachusetts, and that would cover a lot of the country back in 1960. In 1959, I'm glad you asked this question because, oh, that's Nelson Rockefeller. I'm glad you asked this question. I'll get somebody on it later. In 1959, the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, could have faced a challenge from the Republican governor, Nelson Rockefeller, who is the leader of the Republican moderate liberal wing. However, hey, he didn't have to put it off. He told you almost immediately that he would not be a candidate for president because he went on the national tour and he found he had no support, that the Republicans liked Dick Nixon. The Cold War, communism, civil rights movement, space, closing the missile gap between the USSR and the US, all on the table as issues. Kennedy being Catholic, there was a question about Kennedy. and his ability to place the national interest above the wishes of the Pope. Al Smith had run for president back in 1928. He suffered from being a Catholic. Joe Biden did not have that problem last year when he was running for president. Age and experience. Both men were born in the 20th century. Both were rather young. Kennedy was born in 1917. Nixon born around 1913, 1914, somewhere around there. So they were both in their 40s. Nixon had been the vice president since 53. They had both been in Washington since 1947 as congressmen, so they knew their way around Washington. And this would set up for the rest of their lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives, how the presidential campaign would go. This is 1960, September 1960. This is Chicago. And that is Howard K. Smith, the moderator of the debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Now, John Kennedy's father ran a studio, Hollywood studio. And if you take a look at John Kennedy, his hair is perfect. He is wearing a suit, black and white TVs for the most part in those days. He is wearing a suit that matches the backdrop. Take a look at Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon looks like, well, he looks like he just got off the IRT in Midtown Manhattan. And it's July 23rd, and it's a hot, steamy day in Manhattan. You know those kind of days. And he has been packed like a sardine in a subway car that doesn't have any ventilation or does not have any air conditioning. And he looks terrible. He also has a 5 o'clock shadow. Kennedy is well coiffed. Look at his hair, not a hair out of place. He's well shaven. Nixon isn't. And Nixon's also suffering from a knee injury, and he's a little bit under the weather at this point. And he looks terrible. And the first time the question ever comes up, because this is the first presidential debate ever on TV, does he look presidential? Over the years, I've done this talk about TV and also other things, and people have told me they voted for Kennedy based on how cool, calm, and collective he was and how Nixon looked. If you, I was in college and I had to look at this debate and listen to the debate. It's a tale of two different debates. If you look at it, you can't keep your eyes off Kennedy. If you listen to it, you can't help but hear Nixon. Really, really strange dynamic there. But this changes how people approach the presidency. If you're good looking, if you're telegenic, if you have a good story to tell, that all makes sense in now the growth of television as the major medium covering presidential elections. Kennedy arrived for the Chicago debate well tanned. He was in Florida, well tanned, well rested. Nixon was recovering from a knee injury he had suffered in North Carolina during the campaign. JFK was very comfortable before the camera. Nixon wasn't. He was nervous. He sweated profusely and had the 5 o'clock shadow. JFK's suit matched the backdrop at the Chicago CBS studios. Radio listeners of the debate, there was a poll, whether it was Gallup or Harris, they said, hey, Nixon won the debate. He won the debate. The larger television audience, a poll, again, and they still do these polls today, if you watch CNN and all that, during the presidential campaigns, the television audience believed that Kennedy won by a wide margin. Nixon did improve his looks for the next 3 debates. I met Nixon in 1985 and got to know him after covering his story when he came back into proper society after Watergate, 11 years in exile. Nixon did look better. The first Kennedy-Nixon debate changes politics. TV becomes the force during the campaign. No more news, no more books, no more radio. TV becomes the great political force because of visuals. Now, Kennedy did win the 1960 presidential race, but there is something in common with what happened in 2020. It was highly contested. JFK won by a narrow margin. Nixon did concede. But there was a group of politicians not happy, and they decided to contest the race even though Nixon did concede. The group was made up of mostly white conservative electors from the South who opposed JFK's quote-unquote liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for Black Americans. That would be the Martin Luther King Atlanta arrest, where he helped get him out of jail. The 1960 election, and the Electoral College. Republicans claim there was voter fraud. Stop me if you heard this year. Voters fraud in 11 states and filed suits in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois, which Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes. The suit in Illinois charged that the Democratic stronghold of Cook County, Chicago, had dug up Kennedy votes from the cemeteries of Chicago. The suit said that dead people voted for Kennedy. The judge threw out the suits. Nixon took no part in this. He stayed away because he said our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis, which is kind of interesting that I'm giving this talk today as what is going on in Washington in the Senate right now. Topple JFK if possible. That was the motto of these people from Atlanta and Mississippi, because the people in Atlanta and Mississippi would not cast their votes for Kennedy, who had won both states. Mississippi's 8 electors and 6 of Alabama's 11 electors were unpledged. The electors lobbied their counterparts in other states to aid and abet the plan. Plan A was for the electors from 11 southern states to use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop, aid communist countries, to stop and aid communist countries, and to support state rights, a code for resisting racial integration. If Kennedy refused, well, there's Plan B, a resolution calling for the reversing of the position of the candidates in the election, making Lyndon Johnson president and Kennedy would be vice president. So skullduggery is going on. Hey, we got the guy. We got the guy. Here he is. He's Harry Byrd. Plan C, electors, Republican electors from all 50 states would meet in Chicago. Pick a president from a list of outstanding Southern men. Among the choices, Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, the segregationist governor of Arkansas, Orville Farbus, Ross Barnett, also segregationist of Mississippi, and the Georgia Senator Richard Russell. Byrd would receive 15 electoral votes for president in the 1960 election as unpledged electors from Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma casted their votes for Byrd instead of Kennedy. What was their goal? To cast doubt over Kennedy's victory. Was he legitimate or not? And create the perception that a JFK presidency would be illegitimate. The results stood. Kennedy won 303 electoral votes. Richard Nixon got 219. Harry Byrd, 15. That was it. Now, over in Africa, and I was in 9th grade in Stewie Gates's class in Spring Valley High School in Spring Valley, New York, in Rockland County. And we spent a lot of time talking about Africa that year, awful lot of time talking about Africa that year, and a lot was going on in the 1960s in Africa. Between January and December, 17 sub-Saharan African nations, including 14 French colonies, gained independence from the former European colonies. Why? Well, at the end of World War II in 1945, Africans involved in the pro-independence movements put pressure on colonial powers, reminding them of their promises made to secure their support in the war. The colonizing countries, pushed by the United States and debt and money, were obliged to let the colonies go. That is Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, who talked about the winds of change in Africa in 1960. He was the conservative British Prime Minister, and he delivered the talk to the Parliament of South Africa on February 3rd. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Macmillan spent a month in Africa visiting a number of British colonies. The speech signaled clearly that the conservative-led UK government had no intention to block the independence to many of these territories. Why? The Brits needed money. It was no longer worth their while to continue having these colonies when they were having problems back home with their economy. And there is Macmillan later on in life. But there is a problem with apartheid in South Africa, separating whites and blacks. As a fellow member of the Commonwealth, it is our earnest desire to give South Africa our support and encouragement, but I hope you wouldn't mind me saying frankly, there are some aspects of your policies which make it impossible for us to do this without being false to our own deep convictions about the political destinies of free men to which in our own territories we are trying to affect. In other words, we're not supporting apartheid anymore. And that gets the ball rolling. By 1964, the International Olympic Committee throws South Africa out of the Olympic movement. Eichmann is captured, one of Adolf Hitler's really bad guys. Adolf Eichmann is captured in South America. On May 23rd, the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announces that the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann had been captured and will stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer who organized Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question, was seized by Israeli agents in Argentina on May 11th and smuggled to Israel 9 days later. He was sentenced to death and hanged on June 1st, 1962. Now, getting back to Bill Cullen and The Price is Right and all that other wonderful stuff from those days, the United States experienced phenomenal economic growth after World War II, ended in 1945. The war brought prosperity in the post-war period as the United States consolidated its position as the world's richest country. The business of America was the business of America, and that included a very, very, very strong auto industry, along with a vibrant steel industry. And America had no competition after the war. There was no Japan, there was no Germany, nobody was competing with America, and America was supplying the world with goods. Everything was good. Everything was good during the Eisenhower years. Hey, look, there's a DeSoto. Tell them Groucho sent you. And for those of you who don't get the reference, on You Bet Your Life, the TV show that Groucho did. It was sponsored by DeSoto, and Groucho said, tell them Groucho sent you there to the car dealership. Funny thing about the DeSoto, it's gone by 1961, and the beginning of the end of the Rust Belt is in sight in 1960. The automobile industry was partially responsible for this boom. Cars produced in the Detroit area annually quadrupled between 1946 and 55. There was a housing boom. People went out, if you were in the New York area, there was Levittown. There was a place in New Jersey. Rockland County started building up in New York in the 1950s, stimulated partly by the Tappan Zee Bridge opening up. And there was easy, affordable mortgages for the returning servicemen who were able to go to college, get good jobs, and this all fueled the expansion for part of the population of the United States, I should add. The rise in defense spending, the Cold War, hey, you know what? We got that problem with the Soviet Union. We'll spend and spend and spend on defense, and you know, that helps the economy. The auto industry was dominated by three large companies in Detroit, or Detroit area: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. And the unionized automaker made a great living and had great benefits going on. Money was plentiful. There were a lot of industries there. As I said, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, all had booming industries fueled by the car industry and steel. And of course, the car industry was the biggest buyer of steel, which was Pittsburgh, which was West Virginia. And in that area. So, hey, it was booming. Pittsburgh was one of the big cities at one time in the United States. So was Cleveland, because, you know, steel in Pittsburgh, Cleveland being a port. And Bethlehem Steel was another big company. The steel industry prospered after World War II. Steel industries in Germany and in Japan were devastated by Allied bombing. Between 1948 and 58, the steel mills in the United States, they had 700,000 workers, including a steel mill down north, steel in Alabama. The steel mills were producing steel at a furious pace, making more than half of the world's steel in the 1940s and 40% of the world's steel in the 1950s. But things were beginning to fall apart because everybody was sitting on their hands. They had become fat cats in the auto industry, and they couldn't foresee that, oh, Japan might do something. Germany may do something when they get themselves together. Americans were on the move as well in the 1950s into the 1960s. Hey, there's a model home. Go take a look at it. Maybe you'll buy it. The humming economy, but fewer workers were producing goods. They were providing more services. By 1956, a majority of those working had white-collar jobs: corporate managers, teachers, salespersons, office employees. Some firms granted an annual wage, long-term employment contracts, and other benefits. But here's the problem. Farmers. Farmers are beginning to face tough times. Gains in productivity led to agriculture consolidation. Farming became a big business. Family farms found it difficult to compete, and more farmers would lead the land. There is trouble ahead, particularly in the Rust Belt. General Motors, U.S. Steel dominated the industries. They were among the biggest, most profitable businesses in the world at that time. The Rust Belt was an economic giant, accounting for more than half of the U.S. manufacturing jobs in 1950, 43% of the U.S. jobs. But the decline starts in the 1950s because the dominant industries didn't have any competition for product or labor, and they had little incentive to innovate or become more productive. They sat on their hands, and that would hurt American business. Oh, there's Ike and Nixon. By 1960, the gross national product, which measured all goods and services produced in the U.S., topped $500 billion. The U.S. was by far the richest and most powerful nation in the world. But there was a recession that started in 1958, and it continued into 1960. The good times were coming to an end. A lot of culture that you enjoyed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s has a place from 1960. Elvis gets out of the Army. He leaves Fort Dix and goes back into showbiz, but Elvis creatively died. He comes back, and he's not the same swivel hips after being in the Army. On March 5th, Sergeant Elvis Presley was honorably discharged from a 2-year stint in the U.S. Army. He remained on reserve service but wasn't called up again. He had been drafted back in 1958. Elvis returned quickly to performing. He was seen nationally on the Frank Sinatra Show with Nancy Sinatra on May 12th. Oh, the Silver Beatles become the Beatles. Now, Paul McCartney has a theory. England no longer required young men to go into the English armed forces. And all these guys are from Liverpool. And McCartney's theory was, had there been a draft and all these guys went into the military, the Beatles would have been a local group, played some churches and all that other stuff. They would have gone to serve their country. They would have come back, and they would probably never meet up again. This is 1960, and that is John Lennon, George Harrison, Pete Best, the drummer, Paul McCartney, Stu Sutcliffe. The Beatles begin a residency in Hamburg as the Beatles. The Silver Beatles was one of the earliest names of the group. John Lennon wanted a name that sounded English. He wanted the Crickets, but Paul McCartney laughingly said, "I think that's already taken, Buddy Holly and the Crickets." By the way, Paul McCartney owns Buddy Holly's music catalog now. Stuart Sutcliffe, who didn't stay with the Beatles very long, suggested, hey, let's call ourselves the Beatles, B-E-T-L-E-S. The name is changed again to the Beatles with the Beat, B-E-A-T. And on August 18th, they give their first public performance at the Injured Club in Hamburg. John liked the name Beatles, but he changed the name a few times because it had the word beat in it. The Silver Beatles was the name that stayed with them for most of the Hamburg tour, but they become the Beatles. Oh, another 1960s icon, Cassius Clay, wins the gold medal for the light heavyweight division at the Olympics. Muhammad Ali beats the Poland Zbigniew Piotrowski to win the gold medal in the light heavyweight division in 1960. But, you know, here's the world's toughest guy, right? But in 1960, he wasn't. He didn't even want to go to Europe because he didn't want to fly from Louisville to San Francisco for the U.S. Olympic trials because he hated flying. And he'd rather skip the trip than get on the plane for another long plane flight. Well, eventually he does go on the plane. And he purchases a parachute and straps it to his back for the flight in case there's trouble, and he can parachute out. And there is me, and a very well-traveled Muhammad Ali, who did not have any parachutes on his back by the time I caught up with him in 1985. Oh, the first Playboy Club opened. That's Hugh Hefner. He opened the first Playboy Club in Chicago, named after the magazine he had founded in the 1950s. And it wasn't just bunnies running around. It opens in Chicago, February 28th, and he has Bobby Short there, and he has Professor Irwin Corey and Mabel Mercer and Mae Barnes, and he's got the Playboy bunnies. Waitresses that are doling out cigarettes, drinks, and food to the guests, and Hefner is there. He would open clubs in the United States and around the world. By 1963, Gloria Steinem, a women's liberation pioneer, decided to go underground and write about the experience of the bunny, which wasn't as glamorous as Hefner made it out to be. The pill comes into society in 1960, and it's birth control. And you talk to the women's liberation people, they said that the pill helped women advance their cause in the workplace. So they did not have to worry about becoming pregnant. The pill and Hefner, the roadmap to the 1960s. It starts in 1960, the pill and Hugh Hefner. On May 9th, the U.S. Becomes the first country to legalize the birth control pill. The introduction of the birth control pill in the 1960s opened the door for more women to find employment opportunities and further their education. But that educational path in the 1960s was very narrow because women could only, for the most part, become teachers, secretaries, and nurses as professionals. Motown, there's Smokey Robinson. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Motown starts in 1960. It's formed by Berry Gordy Jr., incorporated as the Motown Record Corporation in Detroit. Motown releases its first hit, Money, That's What I Want, sung by Barrett Strong, written by Berry Gordy and Janie Bradford. The talent that they signed, a who's who of the 1960s. The Marvelettes, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, The Miracles featuring Smokey Robinson, Bobby Rogers, Ron White, Pete Moore, Cordette Robinson. Mary Wilson just passed away the other day. She was a member of the Supremes, which was a huge group, and of course you had all the other Motown sounds. Oh, another 1960s thing was the Twist, which was a big deal. Chubby Checker, you probably did the Twist. Chubby's still around, still out there performing. The Hank Ballard version of the song The Twist became a popular Baltimore television dance show host. Became popular because of the Baltimore television dance show host and a local DJ named Buddy Dean. Dean recommended the song to Dick Clark, who is the host of the national ABC show American Bandstand. The show proved very popular with the audience, and Dick Clark wanted to get Ballard on the show. Couldn't find him, but he found someone else. Found somebody else. There was a local guy in Philadelphia and in New Jersey by the name of Chubby Checker. Chubby Checker. His voice is similar to Ballard's, and he sings the song on American Bandstand. And on the Dick Clark Saturday Night Show, it becomes a national sensation, The song goes to the top of the American charts. The Twist becomes a big thing in the 1960s. But Chubby Checker is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is behind me right there. Checker goes on to the show August 6, 1960. The song becomes an overnight hit. The Twist is globally accepted as a dance. Now, White Christmas by Bing Crosby and The Twist, the only records to achieve #1 status on the Billboard Hot 100 twice, separate times. Yet Chubby Checker has never been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Still, the song is honored by the Cleveland Shrine. The Twist. It was a big deal. It's the last season of 16 teams. Major League Baseball, there is Mickey Mantle of the New York Yankees. The Continental League in baseball was being formed, and the New York Senator Kenneth Keaton was on board. The National League, though, said, hey, we'll put teams in Houston and New York. The Continental League owners from New York said, okay, we'll go into the National League. That ends the new league. The New York Mets franchise was the catalyst in ending the proposed circuit in 1960. The American League reacted to the National League expanding into New York and Houston by putting a team in Los Angeles. The Mets and Houston started in 1962. The Los Angeles team, the Angels, and the new Washington Senators, after Calvin Griffith moved his Washington Senators after the 1960 season to Bloomington, Minnesota, would start in 1961. Football is jolted as well. The American Football League starts in 1960. There is me and Pete Rozelle, the commissioner of the National Football League, in 1986 down at Foley Square. Southern District Courthouse, USFL, NFL antitrust trial. Rozelle became the National Football League commissioner in 1960. The NFL goes into Dallas. The American Football League starts. The Chicago Cardinals moved to St. Louis because CBS wanted them out of Chicago, gave them $500,000 to go there. And there's a 30-minute documentary CBS airs called The Violent World of Sam Huff, narrated by Walter Cronkite, that provided America a close-up look at pro football. Pro football is on the verge of exploding as a major business in the United States in 1960. The legacy: Kennedy would replace Dwight Eisenhower. The Cold War continues through this day. 1960 would usher in a change of culture, including how a presidential candidate or presidential candidates use television. Vietnam would become a major problem. Castro's influence would continue to grow. Apartheid would become a global issue. Hugh Hefner would influence many, many young boys of the 1960s, and I'm one of them. And the culture changes. Motown, the twist, the pill, the sexual revolution really starts in 1960, and the Rust Belt begins to start rusting. I want to thank Mathia for inviting me. I hope you enjoyed strolling down memory lane. I'll get this right now, memory lane. And also, I forgot one other thing. Hawaii became a state in 1960. So you could go, instead of to the territory, you could go to Honolulu if you could afford the plane fare at that time, and jet planes came in 1958, and you could go to the 50th state of the United States, Hawaii. Thank you so much, Mathia, for inviting me, and I hope everybody is well, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a good day. Take care. Bye-bye.